Just as my mother-in-law was heading over to the couple to retrieve the Tupperware, my father-in-law suddenly collapsed, tumbling out of his chair. Everyone's attention immediately shifted to him. He clutched his stomach, clearly in significant pain. "What's wrong?" someone asked, concern etched on their face. Amidst the commotion, my father-in-law managed to utter something that took me by surprise. "I only had a little bit of food from the kitchen. Why is my stomach suddenly upset?" I caught my mother-in-law's response. "Did you eat some of that?" "I'm Elizabeth, a 20-year-old housewife. My husband Vernon and I married last year. Being the same age, our conversations and values align perfectly, which has made our relationship harmonious. Our love has only deepened since we got married. However, there was one aspect that unsettled me slightly when we first got married. During our visit to my in-laws to offer our wedding greetings, I noticed my mother-in-law's rather traditional perspective. "When you get married, you come to live with us, right?" she had asked as though it were a given. My husband and I responded in unison, "What?" We both had no intention of living with his parents. My husband clarified, "No, we plan to live independently, just the two of us." My mother-in-law's reaction was one of shock. "What? But you're the eldest son." Both my husband and I were taken aback and uncomfortable with her response. Sensing the tension, my father-in-law interjected, "That's an old-fashioned way of thinking. Do whatever you want, Elizabeth and Vernon." While that seemed to settle the matter for the moment, another issue loomed, worsening the atmosphere. Neither my husband nor I had planned a wedding ceremony. We preferred to avoid anything too extravagant and had discussed using the money for travel and other experiences instead. When I informed my parents about our decision, my mother-in-law's face turned a shade of green. "How can you not have a wedding?" My mother-in-law's voice was filled with disbelief. As I mentioned before, she was quite traditional and strongly opposed our decision to skip a wedding. "How will we explain to our relatives that the eldest son isn't having a wedding?" she demanded. To her, the eldest son's wedding was a significant event, and she couldn't accept any deviation from her beliefs. Fortunately, my father-in-law came to our rescue. "None of the relatives really care about the wedding," he said. "They just see it as a chance for a nice meal. In time, they'll forget there wasn't a wedding. If you two decide against it, that's perfectly fine." His understanding and respect for our wishes were a relief, sparing us from having to conform to my mother-in-law's traditional expectations. Despite her disappointment, we went ahead with our plans. We married without a ceremony and began living independently. I embraced my role as a housewife, supporting my husband by handling the daily household tasks. I find joy in preparing lunch and dinner for him, and our life together has been fulfilling and happy. I think it will be even more enjoyable when we have children someday. About 2 months after our marriage, my parents-in-law invited us to visit. Given the previous disagreements with my mother-in-law, we were a bit apprehensive. However, since we hadn't been to their house since our wedding, we decided it was time to go. I braced myself for any lingering hostility from my mother-in-law, but to my surprise, she was nothing but welcoming. "If you have any questions about being a housewife, don't hesitate to ask me," she offered. "I have all kinds of recipes and would be happy to share everything I know." My mother-in-law, who loves cooking, often hosts gatherings for the neighbors. She proudly mentioned that her home parties are quite popular and that she holds them regularly. On this visit, I enjoyed a delicious home-cooked meal prepared by her. Both my father-in-law and mother-in-law were incredibly kind, and I felt reassured. My worries about the past disagreements melted away, and I realized I didn't need to be anxious anymore. I felt reassured, and my husband felt the same way. He believed that visiting his parents occasionally would be no problem. About 3 months later, my in-laws invited us to a dinner party at their house. Given the warm experience we had during our last visit, we were eager to go. When we arrived, my mother-in-law served a meal that looked like it belonged in a high-end restaurant. My husband praised her cooking enthusiastically. "You're getting better and better," he said. "You didn't make anything like this when I was a kid. This dish is fantastic. Thank you for preparing such amazing food." My mother-in-law beamed with pride at his compliments and encouraged me to eat as much as I wanted. I enjoyed the evening, but later that night, I began to experience a severe stomachache. As I sat in the bathroom, I started to feel faint and weak. "Hey, Elizabeth, are you okay?" My husband's voice seemed to fade as I struggled to stay conscious. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. Apparently, my husband had called an ambulance and I was rushed to the hospital. The doctor couldn't determine the cause of my illness. They ruled out food poisoning and other common issues. The only suspicion I had was that the pasta I had for lunch might have had too much olive oil. I never did find out what caused my illness. After being put on an IV drip and getting some much-needed rest, I felt better. My husband and I went home and went to bed, puzzled by the whole experience. For a while, I was symptom-free, but 2 months later, it happened again. I suddenly felt unwell, and once again, it followed a meal at my in-laws' house. The only common factor was my mother-in-law's cooking. I wondered if her food was somehow spoiled, but my husband, who had eaten the same meal, was perfectly fine. A month later, the same thing happened after another dinner at my in-laws. Concerned, I invited a friend over for lunch to discuss what might be causing this recurring issue. Could it be stress? She suggested. Her comment made me a bit anxious. I had always tried to be trusting and open-minded, but perhaps I had developed some nervousness around my mother-in-law. Plus, getting sick every time we visited her house was becoming a troubling pattern. My husband shared my concern. He suggested we should take a break from visiting my parents-in-law for a while. Though we didn't know the exact cause, it seemed clear that my symptoms were consistently linked to meals at my in-laws' house. My husband speculated that it might be related to my mother-in-law's cooking. I began to wonder if that might be the case. Afterward, my mother-in-law reached out several times, inviting us for dinner. My husband consistently declined the invitations, keeping my health in mind. However, we received another invitation for a dinner party that we couldn't easily refuse. My brother-in-law and his wife were coming to my in-laws' house to offer their wedding greetings. Although I was a bit anxious, as I had been feeling better by avoiding my in-laws' house, my husband assured me that I didn't need to eat much if I wasn't up for it. I decided to try to limit my intake as much as possible. On the day of the party, my mother-in-law greeted me with her usual warmth. As long as we engaged in conversation, I felt fine. Maybe it really was something wrong with the food. Later, my brother-in-law and his wife arrived and we had a pleasant chat. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law expertly prepared the dishes and the table began to fill with an array of beautifully presented and delicious-looking food. Despite the appealing presentation and the fact that the food I had sampled so far tasted great, I still couldn't understand why I kept getting sick. As soon as we sat down, my mother-in-law encouraged me to try the food. "Elizabeth, you mentioned you liked this dish, didn't you? I made it especially delicious today, so please try it." I felt uncertain about what to do. Just then, my husband interjected, "Elizabeth isn't feeling her best today, so let her eat what she can manage." My mother-in-law responded with a nonchalant, "Well." My mother-in-law set a small plate with a modest serving in front of me and asked, "This amount should be fine, right?" I was unsure of what to do when my brother-in-law spoke up. "Elizabeth, if you're not feeling well, you don't have to force yourself," he said. "I've already greeted you, so if you're feeling sick, don't hesitate to go home and rest." It turned out my husband had informed his brother and sister-in-law about my situation, and they were both aware of what was happening. Their concern was comforting. Seeing that she couldn't insist I eat, my mother-in-law said, "Well then, I'll pack it up in a Tupperware for you to take home." I was puzzled by her insistence, but I figured if I took it home, I wouldn't have to eat it anyway. I gratefully accepted, saying, "Okay, thank you very much." Just as my mother-in-law went to get the Tupperware, my father-in-law suddenly collapsed and fell from his chair. Everyone turned to see him clutching his stomach in apparent agony. "What's wrong with you?" someone asked. He hadn't even touched the food on the table yet. "What in the world is going on?" My father-in-law then said something that took us by surprise. "I just had a little bit of food from the kitchen. Why is my stomach suddenly upset?" I heard my mother-in-law's anxious response, "Did you eat some of that?" Without hesitation, my husband called for an ambulance. My mother-in-law accompanied my father-in-law to the hospital, leaving us in a state of shock at their house. I kept thinking about her earlier comment and realized that my brother-in-law's wife might have experienced something similar. "We should investigate the kitchen," I suggested, suspecting there might be a hidden issue. We went to the kitchen where my mother-in-law had been preparing the food and found something alarming. We immediately drove to the hospital where my father-in-law had been taken. At the reception desk, we learned which room he was in and went straight there. As we entered, we heard the doctor asking my mother-in-law if she had any idea what was wrong with her husband. She claimed she knew nothing about it. When we walked into the room, my mother-in-law looked flustered. "Oh, you all came here," she said, trying to dismiss our concerns. "It's all right. As long as I'm here, everything will be fine." But we were determined not to let this opportunity slip by. "I need to talk to you," I said firmly, walking up to her with my husband, brother-in-law, and his wife following. "What is wrong with you all?" I demanded. My father-in-law's condition had stabilized somewhat, and his complexion looked better, but the cause of his distress was still unknown. Apparently, he had been conscious for a while after arriving at the hospital. But after multiple trips to the bathroom, he became severely dehydrated and lost consciousness. I looked my mother-in-law straight in the eye, took something out of my bag, and held it up for her to see. When she saw it, her face turned pale. "Do you recognize this?" I asked. "Did well, what is it?" she stammered, feigning ignorance. "This is a laxative," I said. I couldn't understand why there were so many powdered laxatives in the kitchen. My mother-in-law fell silent at my discovery. The doctor, examining the situation, said, "It appears your father-in-law's symptoms were caused by ingesting a large amount of laxative. We'll run some tests to confirm. If we find evidence of laxatives, we'll need to ask him when he ingested them. If he doesn't know, it means someone else intentionally administered them, which could lead to charges of injury." My mother-in-law's face went pale with panic. "No, it's not like that," she stammered. "I didn't try to make him eat that food. It was just negligence." My husband, visibly upset, pressed her. "Then who were you trying to feed this to?" "It's not." My mother-in-law began to protest, but her voice faltered. "If you won't tell us, we'll have to involve the police and have them investigate," my husband said firmly. Realizing she had no other option, my mother-in-law confessed. "All right, I'll tell you. It was meant for Elizabeth. I intended to punish her by putting laxatives in her meal." "Punish me? What did I ever do to deserve this?" I asked, bewildered. "You're the reason my son has become a bad son," she said bitterly. "You didn't live with us, and you didn't have a wedding. It's all because of you persuading him to make these decisions. You're my enemy." Her resentment seemed unfounded and unjustified. My husband and I looked at each other, appalled. "Is this why you've been putting laxatives in the food I've been eating?" I asked. "It wasn't a lot of laxatives before," my mother-in-law insisted, trying to minimize her actions. "That's why you were fine." "Don't be ridiculous," I retorted. I was rushed to the emergency room. "How can you claim it wasn't a lot?" My husband and brother-in-law echoed my frustration, condemning her actions. "I can't forgive you for what you did to Elizabeth," my husband said angrily. "I'd be furious too if it were my future wife being treated like this." Both my husband and brother-in-law declared that they were disarming my mother-in-law. Her face contorted with fear and desperation as she begged them not to say such things. My father-in-law, who had been semi-conscious throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. "You've done a terrible thing out of ego. You should be arrested by the police. I'm deeply disappointed in you." "But even if you say that, you're not divorcing me, are you?" my mother-in-law pleaded. "That's not enough," my father-in-law continued. "You're going to pay Elizabeth $30,000 in damages, and of course you'll need to work for it. I won't be helping you in any way." "No, that's impossible," she cried. "I've been a stay-at-home mom all my life." "Shut up," my father-in-law cut her off. "If you don't accept these terms, I'll divorce you immediately and report you to the police." With no other options, my mother-in-law reluctantly agreed. She began working hard to pay me the $30,000, slowly making payments as she worked through her obligations. My father-in-law keeps a close watch on my mother-in-law to ensure she doesn't try to cheat. All of her salary is being used to pay the damages she owes me, and she looks quite overwhelmed. However, I believe she deserves it for the pain she caused. Meanwhile, my husband and I are living happily. Both my father-in-law and husband assured me that I don't have to see my mother-in-law again, which has brought me a great sense of relief. I know I've been through a lot, but with the support of my husband and father-in-law, I feel confident that I'll be okay no matter what happens. It's shocking to think that feeding someone food laced with laxatives is a criminal act. It seems extreme for a mother-in-law to act so maliciously without hesitation. I often wonder how my father-in-law ended up married to someone like her, though it seems the two sons turned out to be decent individuals. Although the truth of her character remains unclear, the punishment she is receiving feels appropriate. I hope she works hard to repay the $30,000 and that my husband and I continue to live happily